Hi guys. Today we are going to be talking about 23.3, which is natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow, and how those three things can alter the allele frequency within a population. So there's three major factors that can alter the allele frequencies in a population to cause evolutionary change to occur. First is natural selection, second is genetic drift, and third is gene flow. Natural selection is the differential success in reproductive population. So in reproduction itself results in certain alleles being able to be passed from the one generation to the next in greater proportions. For example, the allele that confers resistance to DDT increases the frequency after DDT was widely used in agriculture. DDT is a pesticide, so insects were able to pass on the allele frequency for the immunity basically to that pesticide, because if they have it, they are unable, or if they have the DDT gene, they are still able to be resistant to that pesticide. Genetic drift is on the smaller scale. So on the smaller a sample, the greater the chance of deviation from the predicted result will happen. Genetic drift describes how allele frequencies can fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. And genetic drift tends to reduce genetic variation through the loss of allele from that original population. The founder effect occurs when a few individuals become isolated from the larger population and found a new population. I like to think of the founder effect by thinking about our ancestors when they came from Europe and immigrated to the US. They founded their area in major cities. Almost every major city has a Little Italy. Almost every major city has a Chinatown. If you think Boston, we have a Little Italy, we have a Chinatown, and we also have Southie. A lot of people forget because not every major city has a Southie, but Southie was founded by the Irish. So we are able to see that founder effect inside our major cities. Although the founder effect is a little bit different than immigration and emigration, the idea behind it can be seen using the vocab word. Allele frequencies in the small founder population can be different from those in the larger population. Because it's a smaller population, it's a smaller gene pool to pick from when reproduction happens. The bottleneck effect is a sudden reduction in population size due to the change in the environment. You guys physically have seen the bottleneck effect happen. You just didn't know that that's what it was called. The resulting gene pool from the bottleneck effect may no longer be reflective of the original population's gene pool. If populations remain small, it may further be affected by genetic drift. Think of when everyone is outside in the student parking lot for a fire drill. And then all of a sudden, we go back inside. And you take this huge population. There's about 600, 700 people outside. We have to go through this little tiny doorway. That doorway acts as the movement of the population and can shut at any time, and only those that get into the building are able to survive. Thinking of it that way. So going through a doorway, only the ones that get through the doorway are able to survive. And that can be seen using this graphic. So your original population, there's a lot of people in this little tiny doorway. The bottleneck event flips the bottle upside down, and only the surviving population genes stick. So we can see we have a lot of white, a lot of blue, some yellow. The bottleneck event totally eliminates that yellow gene. So that yellow gene could be anything. Understanding the bottleneck effect can increase the understanding of how human activity affects other species around us. We are a very selfish population where we don't necessarily care. Some of us care. But as a whole, the population doesn't really care about what happens to other populations as long as we are able to survive, which makes the human population seem greedy or selfish or anything like that. So this is just a case study showing the genetic drift on the greater prairie chicken. The loss of the prairie habitat due to human need for more space caused a severe reduction in the population of the greater prairie chickens in Illinois. The surviving birds had a low levels of genetic variation, and only about 50% of their eggs were able to hatch. So we can see, this was the original population of the greater prairie chicken. It's kind of a weird looking chicken. But the bottleneck effect between 1820 and 1993, when humans really started colonizing the area, reduced that number of chickens greatly. Researchers used DNA from a museum specimen to compare the genetic variation of the population before and after the bottleneck event. The results showed that some showed a loss of alleles at several different loci, so different locations on the genes of the chicken. Researchers introduced the greater prairie chickens from a population in other states and were successful in introducing the new alleles and were able to re-increase that hatch rate to 90%. As you can see, originally it was up around 96, 99, 93%, and then in 1993 it was down to less than 50%. The effects of genetic drift. There are 4 main effects of it. Genetic drift is significant in small populations. Genetic drift causes allele frequencies to change at random. They could be stable for 10 years and then change for 15. Genetic drift can lead to a loss of genetic variation in populations, and genetic drift can cause harmful alleles to be fixed within populations. Gene flow consists of the movement of alleles among the populations. Alleles can be transferred through the movement of fertile individuals or gametes. For example, think pollen. As pollen is moving, it's cross-pollinating with other flowers, and it's transferring its genetic information to another flower. Gene flow tends to reduce variation among populations over time. Gene flow can decrease the fitness of a population as well. So looking at the great tit, it's a bird. If we just wanted to look at it closely, mating causes gene flow between the central and eastern populations. Immigration from the mainland reduces allele that decreases fitness. Natural selection selects for the alleles that increase fitness, and the birds in the central region with high immigration have a lower fitness. Birds in the east have low immigration and have high fitness. Kind of confusing the way that's worded, but basically it's saying like the population that's traveling has a less success of reproduction versus the population that stays right where it is, has higher fitness, higher chances of reproducing, and less immigration. Gene flow can also increase the fitness of a population. So consider, for example, the spread of alleles due to the resistance of insecticides. Insecticides have been widely used to target mosquitoes that carry the West Nile virus and malaria. Alleles have evolved in some of those populations that confer with the insecticide resistance in these mosquitoes. So the flow of the insecticide-resistant allele into the population can increase the reproductive success of the organisms. Gene flow is an important agent of evolutionary change in humans as well. So natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes the adaptation of evolution to occur. Evolution by natural selection involves both change and sorting. New genetic variation can rise by chance. Beneficial alleles are then sorted and favored by natural selection. Natural selection consistently results in adaptive evolution. Looking closer at natural selection, what it actually is, natural selection brings about adaptive evolution by acting on an organism's phenotype. So, what is its physical expression of those genes? Relative fitness, the phrases struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are misleading. Although that's how we best explain evolution, that those that are best fit for their environment are able to survive, they are misleading as they imply direct competition between individuals. Reproductive success is generally more subtle and depends on many different factors. Relative fitness is the contribution of an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributors of other individuals. Selection favors certain genotypes by acting on the phenotype of certain organisms. Basically, that's saying that you have Darwin's finches. You have a small-beaked finch and you have a large-beaked finch. And you put food out in front of them. Call it acorns and almonds and cashews, things like that. The large-beaked finch is going to survive because he's going to say, I can crack open those seeds. I'm going to survive to reproductive. Where the small-beaked finch is going to be kind of left to eat the leftovers or rely on the larger beaked finch to crack the seed and then try to sneak in and get the seed. But the small-beaked finch isn't fit to eat larger nuts. So in this situation, relative fitness in natural selection is going to favor that larger beaked finch because he is best fit for his environment. We have 3 different ways of showing natural selection occurring. It can be directional selection, disruptive selection, or stabilizing selection. Directional selection favors individuals at one end of the phenotypic range. So typical selection is shown as a bell curve, where your average is in the center. Directional selection is not going to favor what's in the center, but it's going to favor one of the 2 extreme ends. So your bell curve is either going to shift one way or it's going to shift the other way. Disruptive selection favors individuals at both extreme ends. So here's our bell curve, a regular bell curve. Now we're going to end up with 2 bell curves favoring the extreme ends. And stabilizing selection continues to favor that intermediate or average phenotype and acts against both extreme ends, narrowing your bell curve even tighter. Visually, since my hands don't do a good job with graphing, directional selection. So here, our original population is the solid line in all 3 graphs. Directional selection is going to move the bell curve. So here's our original one. It's going to move it towards one of the extreme ends, your extreme ends being the lower sides of the bell curve. In disruptive selection, both extreme ends are favored for, and that average is no longer favored. And in stabilizing selection, the average gets favored on more, which tightens that bell curve up. The key role of natural selection in adaptive evolution. So striking adaptation has arisen by natural selection. So cuttlefish can change color rapidly for camouflage, and the jaws of snakes allow them to swallow prey larger than their heads, so they can have a slow digestion process. So looking at our snake, snakes freak me out. They have a ligament that allows their jaw to open wider than their head, so this egg can sit in their body for a long period of time. Natural selection increases the frequency of alleles that enhance survival and reproductive success. Adaptive evolution occurs as the match between organisms and its environment increases. So think back to that finch. The match between that food availability and that large beak finch occurred and increased that bird's success of survival and reproduction. Because the environment can change, adaptive evolution is a continuous and smooth process. Genetic drift and gene flow do not constantly lead to adaptive evolution, as they can increase or decrease the match between the organism and its environment. Sexual selection is natural selection for mating success. It can result in sexual dimorphism, which is a marked difference between the sexes in secondary sexual characteristics. Peacocks, males have the bright, flashy colors because they want to attract the female. They want to pass on those genes. Female peacocks only have a colorful head. The rest of their body is pretty boring. Intrasexual selection is competition among individuals of one sex, which is often the males, for mates of the opposite sex. This is the ramming of the rams. So if anyone has ever seen videos or been at a zoo when this happens, sometimes this happens at Disney, rams lock horns. The more dominant male will win and wins the rights to reproduce with the female. Intersexual selection, often called mate choice, occurs when individuals of one sex, usually the females, are choosy in selecting their males. This is the peacock. Their females are going to be choosy and pick the one with the brightest, biggest, and most colorful feathers. Male showiness due to mate choice can increase one male's chance of attracting a female while decreasing his chances of survival because he's spending so much time being showy and flashy. If he's not the showiest and the flashiest, he's decreasing his chances of survival. So how do female preferences evolve? So good gene hypothesis suggests that a trait is relative to a male health. Both the male trait and the female preference for that trait should increase the frequency of that trait. If you look at this example of frogs, just showing the recording of their call. This is another showy aspect is mating calls. The preservation of genetic variation. So neutral variation is genetic variation that does not confer a selective advantage or disadvantage to the organism. Various mechanisms help to preserve the genetic variation in populations. Diploidy maintains genetic variation in the form of hidden recessive alleles. Heterozygotes can carry a recessive allele for a hidden trait from the effects of selection. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population. Balancing selection includes the heterozygote advantage and frequency-dependent selection. Heterozygote advantage occurs when heterozygotes have higher fitness than do homozygotes. Natural selection will tend to maintain two or more alleles at that locus. So the sickle cell allele causes mutation in hemoglobin that also confers with malaria resistance. So being resistant to malaria in certain populations can actually increase the chance of mutations in the sickle cell allele. Most commonly found in Africa. Frequency-dependent selection is the fitness of a phenotype declines if it becomes too common in the population. Selection can favor which phenotype is less common in that population. So, for example, frequency-dependent selection selects for the appropriate equal numbers of right-mouthed or left-mouthed scale-eating fish. By natural selection cannot fashion a perfect organism. Selection can only act on existing variations. Evolution is limited to historical constraints. Adaptations are often compromises to the environment, and chance, natural selection, and the environment all interact with one another. That is it for chapter 23. I showed you guys your summative on evolution during our Google Meet. That will go live to you guys probably Monday night. That way you can get a head start on it for Tuesday. You have all day Tuesday to work on it. It's due Thursday at midnight. We do move on to photosynthesis on Friday of next week. So Friday night at midnight is your project due. Friday of next week, we will be moving on to photosynthesis. So really make sure that you're working on that on Tuesday and Wednesday to finish up your project. And if you guys do have any questions, just email me. And I shall talk to you guys later.